Hi, Brian Lehrer here. Up next, Brian Lehrer Weekend. 3 of our favorite segments from the week packaged together for you to listen to on the weekend. So enjoy, and I'll see you back on the radio Monday at 10 a.m. on WNYC and WNYC.org. Wait, that's not the Brian Lehrer Show theme song, but surely many of you will recognize it. It's been 20 years since Freakonomics was published and 15 years of radio stories that uncover the hidden side of everything as they do. Ever wondered what makes a perfect parent, or why drug dealers still live with their parents? For the last 20 years, we've read and listened to Freakonomics host Stephen J. Dubner explore questions like these using the tools of economics in a way that anyone can understand and enjoy. And so in honor of the 20th anniversary of the original Freakonomics book, Stephen Dubner and his co-author, economist Stephen Levitt, have released a new edition. And Stephen Dubner joins us now to reintroduce us to Freakonomics, preview what's in the new version, and give us a taste of what's to come. Stephen, always great to talk. Welcome back to WNYC.
Brian, hi. Thank you. Hi, everybody listening to WNYC. Happy Thanksgiving.
To start at the very beginning, the name Freakonomics. I was surprised to learn that your publisher 20 years ago didn't like the name. What were you going for, and why did it stick?
I mean, why would you be surprised to learn that a publisher doesn't like the author's selection for a title? Yeah, I mean, look, I've been in a few creative industries now, the music industry and journalism and publishing and radio, and now getting into TV. And I do find, I mean, this is not the question you asked me, sorry, but I do find that if you make stuff for a living and you want to do it with your whole heart and soul, that the industry that, you know, invites you in as an ally, you have to, it's tricky because they're businesses. And so they often have a different way of thinking about making stuff. So with Freakonomics, we'd written this book. We had a manuscript that we liked quite a bit, but it didn't have a central theme. And so Steve Levitt's sister, Linda Gines, who unfortunately died several years ago now, way too early from cancer. She was helping us. We had a bunch of people helping us try to come up with a title. And she had worked in publishing and advertising. And she came up with a list of maybe 200 titles, maybe 300. And this was before AI, before you could feed a manuscript in and say, hey, give me, 100 titles, now tweak.
Whoops. Did we just lose your line?
And I both saw Freakonomics. Sorry, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you cut out. I think you cut out just as you were reaching the point of why you chose Freakonomics out of those hundreds of titles.
Yeah, so Freakonomics just made us laugh, basically. And we brought it to the publisher. Levitt and I thought the title was so bad that it might actually be great. And the publisher didn't see it that way in the beginning. And then we kept giving them future titles that were not very good. And I wouldn't be honest if I didn't say we were intentionally giving them ones that weren't very good, because we really thought Freakonomics was good. So finally they agreed with us and we put it out and it worked out okay.
Hey AI, write me 100 bad titles for my book about economics. So the book, for people who don't know, is based on 5 fundamental ideas. So let's go through them one by one. First up, incentives are the cornerstone of modern life. Can you define how you mean incentives and explain how they reveal answers to life's riddles? Because honestly, this one makes me shudder. Like, are we all just subjects in a B.F. Skinner experiment?
Yeah, so I think when a lot of people see the word incentives coupled with the word economics, they assume everything is about financial incentives. And money is obviously a really important piece of modern life, but there are many, many incentives that we all respond to all the time. I think we often have a fixed idea of who we are as individuals, how we want to be seen in the world, how we want to see ourselves. Adam Smith, the sort of proto-economist, talked about the overwhelming urge of people to be lovely and to be treated as if they were lovely and to treat other people as if they're lovely. I mean, if you go back a couple thousand years, you get a golden rule version of that. Don't do to anyone what you don't want done unto yourself. And so while financial incentives are strong, especially as the money gets bigger, I think we all have incentives about our own morality, our own ethics. We care about our reputations. I mean, if you just look at how much time people spend online curating their reputations, which in my mind is a bad way to spend time, because this goes back to something the basketball coach John Wooden used to talk about, the difference between reputation and character. He would tell the young men, basketball players that he was working with, you should worry more about your character than your reputation, because your reputation is simply what other people think about you, whereas your character is who you really are. And I think a lot of us struggle with the difference between character and reputation. So our argument is that incentives really do matter a lot, but often not the incentives that you think. And so you may make a certain decision, you may choose to adopt a certain ally or enemy even, and you think that you are living according to your own truest self, but actually there are all kinds of forces pushing us toward that behavior. Psychologists are quite good at understanding that. So yeah, incentives really matter.
Listeners, anything you always wanted to ask Stephen Dubner listening to Freakonomics, now's your chance. 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. All right. 5 fundamental ideas. We went through number 1. Here's number 2. The conventional wisdom is often wrong. Might be good to explain this through an example of something in the book. Maybe that the one you use is money buys elections. How is this wrong?
Yeah, so money's certainly important, but one really easy way to persuade yourself that money is nowhere near as important as one thinks is just look. You could compile a list of the big money spending candidates over the past 20 years. Just in New York City alone, you could do that. You could look at Mike Bloomberg's presidential run. I can't remember what the total count was for how much he had to spend to get every vote in the primary before he dropped out and revealed himself as a pretty poor candidate for president. Incumbency does come with a lot of advantages. My co-author, Steve Levitt, did a study years ago that was a very clever way to explore this issue, which is looking at congressional races where the same 2 candidates ran against each other multiple times, one being an incumbent and one not. And what money is, look, you saw with Mamdani in this election, how well was Mamdani funded early? Right?
I was going to say you only need 2 words to prove this point. Andrew Cuomo.
Yeah, for sure. So it's a nice, lazy soundbite, nice square box of a conventional wisdom. If you like to complain about how broken and dysfunctional, et cetera, the political system is, and I'm not going to argue with you that it does have a lot of problems, money is not as powerful as one might think. What matters and what happens is attractive candidates attract a lot of money. And then once they start becoming a little bit more successful because they're an attractive candidate, then the money really flows. But money itself, I think, is grotesquely overvalued.
Although, to push back on this, at least theoretically, because I haven't done the analysis, but maybe you as a data geek have, that you have to look not just at the exceptions, but at the rule, right? So if there's so much money being poured by people who have it into campaigns, then it must be for a reason. There must be a history of effectiveness more than not. Is that wrong?
I would look. I would argue that's not entirely wrong, but it's not entirely right either. If you get into the weeds on how political fundraising works, you see it's an industry just like any other. And also, let's not forget, most donors or voters are not working from a gigantic menu of choices. Most people, once they get involved in something, it's whittled down to 2, 4, maybe 8 options. And these are people who want to get a piece of that action because they believe there is some kind of quid pro quo, either functional or moral, that they want to support someone that they think is better and they'll feel good about that, or they want to support someone that they think is better and that they will then benefit from that in some way. But that doesn't really happen often until there's been quite a bit of selection already happening. So if you could, a parallel to maybe think about, this is not a perfect parallel. If you ask people in these exercises that I think you've done on this show quite a bit over the years, how would you spend the next $1 trillion of the federal budget, and how does that sync up with how the budget actually works? Well, there's a pretty vast gap there. So I would argue the same type of gap exists in the way that we think about giving money to campaigns. But that's also not forget the amount of what you could call corporate capture or just donor capture in politics is large. So yeah, if someone is doing well and I can come in with a $10 million donation thinking that this person is going to win and my $10 million is going to get me a lot of traction, then that's how people do it. Look, Sam Bankman-Fried was a really good example of how he played both ends against the middle to make sure that he was going to have as much influence as he could. And, unfortunately for him, he's in prison, so it doesn't work.
Stephen Dubner is with us. If you're just tuning in and you don't recognize the voice, host of Freakonomics Radio here on the station and on that podcast, and co-author of the original book, Freakonomics, which is just out in a 20th anniversary edition. I want to acknowledge that a couple of people have written in to say that they really appreciate the way you sign off on Freakonomics Radio, which is take care of yourself, and if you can, someone else too. And one of these writers says, that says it all about his character, but his reputation is great too. Echoing what you said before, comparing character and reputation. And
I
listeners,
appreciate that.
212-433-WNYC for your Freakonomics questions. And Jim in Astoria, you're on with Stephen Dubner. Hello.
Hey, good morning. So, Stephen, huge fan of your work, but out of the whole corpus, if you could revisit any one article or story, which would it be and why? I'll take my answer off the air.
Oh, I'm so bad at this. I'm really good at at multiple choice. Fill in the blank. I'm not so good at. Let me think. If I could revisit, I like the question a lot, Jim. Also, just so you know, I'm slow. Like I'm a writer by nature, so my brain kind of usually takes a month to mull over something. If I had to really re-examine everything we've ever written, I don't know if it would be a specific story, because we are deliberate, and so we have an idea, we do research, we interview people, we fact check and all that stuff. So we don't publish clunkers, or try not to, at least, and if we do, we amend them. I would say a big thing that I've changed my mind about, at least to a significant degree over the last 10, 15, 20 years, is the degree to which the beautiful version of free market capitalism is supposed to just work out. And I think this was an idea that was promoted from the University of Chicago Economics Department, probably best exemplified by Milton Friedman, but then furthered by people even like Gary Becker, who was politically quite different, and my colleague Steve Levitt, and many, many, many other economists at the University of Chicago that I've had the pleasure to get to really know and understand their work. And there has been, I think, a real deep belief that laissez-faire free market capitalism is not only the best system available to us, but doesn't have many big flaws. I would probably still side on the first part of that equation, that it is probably the best system we've had available to us in the history of humankind and economics. But the flaws are really significant. And I think those flaws over the past 10 or 15 years have become so obvious to everybody and have filtered into our political issues, our social issues, on and on and on, that we need to really examine the ways in which free market capitalism works and doesn't work. And so I would say over the past 5 years, for me, that's been an evolution. Over the past 5 years, I've done quite a few episodes of Freakonomics Radio on the private equity industry. For instance, it's really easy to not notice the private equity industry, but in fact, it has gone from controlling about maybe 4 or 5% of corporate equity about 15 or 20 years ago to now controlling about 20%. And as you can tell by its name, private equity, it operates not in the harsh spotlight of the public markets. There are a lot of ramifications of this. There are a lot of private equity investment funds. There are more private equity investment firms in the US now than there are McDonald's. They're very good at doing a lot of things that nobody else was really doing, including buying up or rolling up sort of what we consider mom and pop businesses in any realm you can think of. Think of any store you've gone into over the last year. They are almost certainly a nice, target. Target sounds a little pejorative, but a target for private equity investors, because these are little businesses that are successful because someone has been running them with their heart and soul for the past generation or two. But when that generation wants to get out and sell, it can be really tough. And so car washes, pawn shops, veterinarian shops, on and on and on, those often get bought up, rolled up into private equity investments. And there are a lot of ramifications of that. And now, furthermore, there's a new Trump executive order maybe 2-3 months ago, which is paving the way for private equity investments to be bought in 401ks and other Main Street retail investors' funds. And so I think there's a lot of examination that needs to continue happening about that issue and many other issues. Our economy is big, dynamic. It's unparalleled in the history of the world, and it's produced many, 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 many wonderful things for many, many wonderful people. We can't deny that, but the downsides are also significant. Everything from income inequality to wage differentials to the way customers are treated when companies grow and have only the bottom line in mind. So yeah, I've become, I wouldn't say a cynic, but skeptical and deeply curious. And I call up people and ask them questions and ask them to explain themselves. That's what I do.
So does that generalize not just to capitalism itself, but to the field of economics and economic analysis? Because you have this line in the book that I think is from the New Forward. Correct me if I'm wrong. The field of economics has been proven both incredibly important and somewhat impotent.
Yes, I stand by that sentence, which I happen to have written. Yeah, I feel like, for me, so I have had what I feel is a great privilege. I'm someone who liked economics. I'd studied it a bit. I'd been interviewing a lot of economists for a book that I was working on about 22 years ago that never got published because Freakonomics happened instead. And then Steve Levitt, my co-author on Freakonomics, became, not just a great collaborator and a great friend, a great partner in every dimension, but he also just kind of took me along as a wingman to sort of join as an honorary member the fraternity of academic economists. And so I got to see and learn a great deal from a lot of very smart and very good people. What I did see, however, is that like anyone who comes to talk their own book because they're so knowledgeable about it, it's easy to sort of miss the forest for the trees. And I think a lot of academic economists who get into government and policy roles, which is quite typical, they will have a theory or an idea about the way the world works, about the way the economy works, that to them is watertight. They've seen the evidence, they've accumulated the data themselves, but it's often really hard for them to adjust their theories to the fact that the world isn't theoretical, the world is real, and actual people, individuals, are living on the other end of those formulas that they write so elegantly. And so, yes, I think that especially when you get into macroeconomics, predictions about the way the economy will move, if you want to look at one big one where most of the really smart economists in America and elsewhere really missed, had to do with when China was admitted to the WTO. The US happily and willingly offshored a great many of our manufacturing jobs. And the quid pro quo was that not only will we get really cheap TVs and all kinds of other stuff from China and other manufacturing centers where we're offshoring our manufacturing. And oh, by the way, we're also offshoring our manufacturing pollution, which is a nice thing. The air in the US didn't get so much cleaner just because we got better. It's also because we stopped doing all that dirty manufacturing. And what we were going to do, what the economists and the policy people told us, was retrain everybody who'd been in manufacturing to have different types of jobs that would pay better and allow them to stay in their communities and have good jobs. It just didn't happen. The people on the other end of that formula were not invited into that circumstance. And we see the ramifications of that in great distress among many, many people in this country. So that's where I say that economists are really, really smart, but nobody's infallible. The future is really hard to predict, and anybody who tells you that they can do it, you should, I think, regard them with a good deal of skepticism.
I think our next caller has a question about economic policy and whether that can be less impotent, your word, than the field of economics. Janet in Crown Heights, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Good morning. My question is, the word now is affordability, and I wonder if governments can really do anything about affordability besides maybe doing housing programs. I think if rent was cheaper, New York would be more affordable, or maybe jobs programs, which Biden did, and it didn't really it paid off for the workers. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a hard question. I don't mean to offer what sounds like a pretty simple solution to a very difficult question, but I will say this. This is where I do think economists are really good, and they've done a lot of work, and it's been empirical work. It's been theoretical work, and they will show you that if we just wanted to talk about affordability with housing, which I would say is really the big one. I mean, you can add up, if you live in New York City, which I know many people listening to this show do, I do as well. If you want to talk about the cost of food, the cost of transportation, I mean, the cost of transportation in New York is fantastically cheap if you use public transportation. Even though it's risen, if you look at it as a share of your overall income, and if you look at it as a share of your income, if you live in a place without good public transportation, getting around New York City is phenomenally affordable. Food can be affordable, can be difficult, but really it's the housing. And what economists say, you need to remove the impediments from the system. And if you look at New York City housing policy, it's just like, it reminds me of opening up a closet or a treasure chest that people have been stuffing little pieces of junk into over the past 100 years. These are little policy planks that are meant to protect one little group and then another little group and then one big group. And so, look, I don't really know what Mayor-elect Mamdani plans to do with housing policy writ large. I do know that some of the people that he's invited into his administration are really smart thinkers about what works and what doesn't work. I think a lot of people who didn't vote for Mamdani are scared that it's going to be some kind of communist socialist utopia where everybody gets to live free wherever they want. I think that's a fairly absurd notion from the outset. But yeah, removing restrictions, removing regulations, making it easier. And you have to realize that for anybody to build a building, they have to have incentives to do so. You have to consider all the parties. So if you look at where the population has grown in the rest of the country over the past 30 years, it's in places that have very loose housing. And that means that developers want to come in and build more. And when you come in and build more, the rent and the prices get cheaper. But here we have just not bitten that bullet. And we consider developers the enemy, which I think is a little bit kooky. These are the people who actually do the work to build the buildings that we live in. So I think there's a reassessment of the way we need to think about how to solve that problem.
Right. The ratio of market rate to affordable that those developers have the power to get approved, that's obviously a big policy question that will be debated a lot after the new year. Let's revisit one more of your principles from the original Freakonomics book 20 years ago. Dramatic effects often have distant, even subtle causes. And this is a really controversial one because you said Norma McCorvey, otherwise known as Jane Roe of Roe versus Wade, had more influence on the crime rate than gun control, a strong economy, or even new policing strategies. You wrote that 20 years ago. How so, according to you, at the time, and do you still believe it?
Yeah, I think that holds up well. I mean, let me preface it by saying anybody who thinks that they should either endorse or not endorse abortion as a means of keeping crime down, it's not a good idea. It's not an effective tool. That's not what it's meant for. What the argument is really about is if a child is born into a situation where that child is not wanted, or the parent or parents aren't in a circumstance to care well for that child's likelihood of having a great life really diminishes a lot. We know that from decades now of social science research. And so that was the mechanism by which the legalization of abortion led to a decrease in crime a generation later, because families, moms, were able to decide better, is this a time for me to have and raise a child and try to help that child thrive and prosper. In terms of why that was bigger than the other forces that you just named, gun control has been mostly a failure because of the way that we've practiced gun control. Not entirely. Gun buybacks are a great example. It's a very dramatic thing. Every police department that ever does it will get on the news that night. And it's just, the guns that people submit to those gun buybacks are the guns that weren't going to be used in crimes anyway, essentially. So that was a kind of an absurd argument in the totality. Strong economy, you would think there's a much stronger relationship between a strong economy and crime. And it turns out that for most crimes, especially violent crime, there's not, which is just a kind of empirical fact. And then police strategies. Look, policing continues to evolve. A lot of things that happen are much better now than they used to be. Some things not as much better as you'd like them to be. But the fact is that, the broken windows policing policy, which was embraced here, and I think probably had some significant positive effect, but also had some significant negative effect. If you measure the degree to which better policing decreases crime, it's a complicated daisy chain. And so we all want better, smarter policing, but it's an evolution that I think is only really just starting now to gain fruition. I think when I see in cities like New York and Chicago, and I think Atlanta, I may be wrong in Atlanta, I think the idea of bringing mental health, professionals into the realm of policing in a way that does not take away the expertise of what police are good at, and in a way that helps the people who are in distress, and just as important, the loved ones of the people that are in distress. We care about the perpetrator, but let's care about the victims primarily, because they're the victims after all. I think what you see is that the police in this country were asked to do a lot of functions over the past several decades that was never an intention of policing originally. And I think they've often tried their best and not succeeded. And now we are reimagining what modern, quote, policing is. And what, quote, modern policing is often very different from this idea of showing up with 10 squad cars when there's an EDP, an emotionally distressed disturbed person, causing a lot of trouble. And like anything in life, as we go on further in civilization and humankind, we like to try to learn from the past and invoke better solutions. And honestly, that's kind of what our project has been about. We don't go around solving a bunch of things with Freakonomics, but we do try to explore new ideas to see if there might be an avenue for better, smarter people to solve problems.
We're almost out of time, but one quick follow-up on that one. How you've explained just now how some of the standard reasons that are given, explanations for decreases in crime, may not hold up. But how do you prove with data that people who weren't born because their mothers had choice didn't commit crimes when they weren't even there to grow up?
Yeah, so this was based on a research paper done by my co-author Steve Levitt and a colleague, John Donahue, who's a legal scholar, I believe now at Stanford. And they wrote, it's an amazing paper. I would really encourage everybody to read it. I mean, the version that we wrote in Freakonomics was pretty thorough. We really tried to show the homework. If I were going to say that Freakonomics stands for one thing, it's trying to be less binary about any argument. This is good, this is bad, this is left, this is right. And what that means is that you have to explore a lot of potential causes or contributors. And so that's what they did in this paper about abortion and the legalization of crime. I'll give one example. They assemble
real quick.
Yeah, they assemble a collage of evidence, and one of which is that 5 states, one piece of which is that 5 states legalized abortion before Roe v. Wade in 1970-71. So if you use those as a kind of variable to measure how crime moved in those places compared to the states that got Roe v. Wade later, that's a good
one
indicator.
Variable.
Yeah.
All right. So Freakonomics, the original book, now 20 years old and re-released with a new foreword by Stephen Dubner and Stephen Levitt. Dubner also the host of Freakonomics Radio, of course. And you said you're doing television coming up. You want to promote it?
Yes, but so I'm making a TV show. It can't be seen yet. I'm hoping we're shooting a season right now. It's the most fun I've had since I was a kid. It's also the scariest thing I've done since I was a kid. And we're privately producing and funding season 1 because I believe, like I said at the beginning, if you want to make something good the way you want it to be, you need to do it yourself. So I think it's going to be, I don't know, I'm the host of it, so it's hard for me to say. It's going to be called Better in Person, which is a belief that, most of us are better in person. I've already interviewed a series of amazing people. They range from architects to rabbis to musicians to former NFL players who now teach math at MIT, et cetera, et cetera. It's a little bit, I love Dick Cavett from the old days. I liked Charlie Rose a lot. Charlie Rose turned out to have some character flaws that we all know about, but going deep with really smart people is something I love. And so, yes, there will be a show called Better in Person with me hosting, available somewhere in 2026.
All right. Well, now we know to look for it. Stephen, thanks a lot. Keep it up.
Thank you, Brian, so much. Appreciate it.
The headlines never stop, and it's harder than ever to tell what's real, what matters, and what's just noise. That's where Pod Save America comes in. I'm Tommy Vitor, and every week I'm joined by fellow former Obama aides John Favreau, John Lovett, and Dan Pfeiffer to break down the biggest stories, unpack what they mean for the future of our democracy, and add just enough humor to stay sane along the way. You'll also hear honest, in-depth conversations with big voices in politics, media, and culture like Rachel Maddow, Gavin Newsom, and Mark Cuban that you won't find anywhere else. New episodes drop every Tuesday and Friday with deep dives every other weekend. Listen wherever you get your podcasts, watch on YouTube, or subscribe on Apple Podcasts for ad-free episodes.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Since September, the U.S. military has carried out 20 strikes, as you probably heard, on boats allegedly smuggling fentanyl in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific, killing at least 80 people, not the fentanyl, the U.S. military strikes. President Trump has claimed with no evidence that each destroyed boat saves the life of 25,000 Americans, presumably by stopping the flow of fentanyl into the country. It's the Trump administration's expedient solution to a complicated problem. America could be made, quote, great again if drug trafficking could only be stopped, if we could only go back to the days before the fentanyl crisis, which is real. But our next guest argues that, quote, there is no wholesome, traditional, drug-free America that we can return to. Americans have always used a lot of drugs, even in the white suburbs and rural areas that Mr. Trump supporters call the real America, unquote. This comes from the article called I Am a Drug Historian. Trump is wrong about fentanyl in almost every way. So joining us now is David Hertzberg, professor of history and director of the Drugs, Health, and Society program at the University at Buffalo. Professor Hertzberg, thanks for your article. Thanks for sharing it with us. Welcome to WNYC.
Thanks for having me.
You write that the first drug crisis came in the Gilded Age of the late 19th century. Tell us that story.
Yeah, so this is a period of time in which the American economy was undergoing industrialization, and so shifting to mass production of new high-tech products that were sold far and wide. And among those new products were more powerful drugs, such as morphine, which was isolated from the opium poppy, and cocaine, which was isolated from the coca plant. And the traditional market protections in America could be described as caveat emptor, or let the buyer beware. And this works in small scale markets where you know the people selling and you're familiar with the products. But it was kind of a disaster in the late 19th and early 20th centuries with all these new products produced by unknown concerns that might be far away. And so in the headlines of that era were all sorts of consumer tragedies, such as women blinded by toxic cosmetics or babies starved to death on swill milk, which looked like milk, but which was incredibly watery. And among those were a sharp increase in addiction to morphine, eventually heroin and cocaine, because these products were available and there were very few limits on how they could be sold. The majority of addiction came from people who went to see doctors and got prescribed these medications because that was the largest market for them. And so it was right there in the doctor visiting classes. In other words, those people with enough money to see a doctor, they weren't particularly in cities, they were overwhelmingly white. And so that was the first sort of drug crisis that looked similar to the initial stages of today's opioid crisis.
Yeah, pharmaceutical prescriptions. In today's case, of course, painkillers, and then people get hooked and turn to street drugs. I mean, that's an eerie echo of what is happening today from that long ago.
Yeah, definitely. And, it really underscores the main point, which is that our drug crisis wasn't caused by foreign traffickers. So it can't be solved by declaring a war on foreign traffickers. And in fact, history suggests that's likely to make things worse. And we can see an example from just our most recent opioid crisis, that transition you identified from people who were using pharmaceutical opioids switching to street drug use. Why did that happen? That happened because when authorities wanted to take action to do something about a growing crisis of addiction to pharmaceutical opioids, the action they took was sort of one of these drug war type actions in which they said, the problem is people are abusing these drugs and we need to stop selling drugs to people who are addicted to them. This was the line of the pharmaceutical industry. This was the line of the first round response. But of course, people who are addicted to a drug are very strongly motivated to keep buying it. And so when they couldn't buy in what I call white markets, those legal pharmaceutical markets, they looked elsewhere to buy. And this created a mismatch in supply and demand in America because illicit market opioids, what I call prohibition markets, they were 20th century old-fashioned markets. They were located in major cities. You had to go there predominantly to buy them. And that wasn't where these folks who had become addicted to pharmaceuticals were living. So you had a lot of people who wanted to spend money on opioids, and you didn't have enough people who were trying to sell them opioids. And that's where the new suppliers stepped in. And these new suppliers were, they were modernizers. They said, wait, why should we deal with farms and farmers and goo extracted with a scalpel from a flower when we can make a synthetic product? And instead of sending it to one of these 20th century central markets where everyone has to go to, we'll bring it to where the consumers are, just like the e-commerce revolution. And so this attempt to shut off the supply with this drug war type policy ended up changing the market in ways that were incredibly dangerous for these people who had developed an addiction. They shifted from using a regulated product that was exactly what it said on the label to using unregulated, unlabeled products that turned out to be much more potent and dangerous in the case of fentanyl, which is the synthetic product that they shifted to.
Is this related to what you call in your piece the white market rather than the black market, this kind of long-term game of cat and mouse between drug companies and drug regulators?
Yeah, so white markets, of course, are the legal pharmaceutical medical markets that sell the products that are probably in many of your listeners' medicine cabinets. And there's this cat and mouse game is between authorities who want to restrain and regulate those markets in the name of public health. These are desirable products, they're good products, but they're also can be really dangerous. So you want to have careful safeguards. The companies selling them tend to believe that they are much less dangerous than authorities do, and they want to sell them much more easily and with fewer restrictions. And so sometimes authorities get the upper hand and these markets are reined in really carefully. And sometimes the manufacturers get the upper hand and they break free and are able to sell a lot of products. We saw that, we already talked about the late 19th century with morphine and cocaine. This happened again from about the 1950s to the 1970s with sedatives and stimulants. So I'm talking about barbiturate sleeping pills, Valium, That's an anti-anxiety drug, and amphetamine, which at the time was used for dieting and as an antidepressant. Huge public health crisis related to too easy sale of all these drugs because the industry had gotten one step ahead of the regulators and were able to sell them kind of like hotcakes. Then when that got reined in the 70s, the next time that the industry won this cat and mouse game was with the beginnings of the opioid crisis in the 1990s.
Listeners, I imagine some of you read this article with the very sticky title that probably made you click on it if you were on the New York Times website. I am a drug historian. Trump is wrong about fentanyl in almost every way. It is David Hertzberg, professor of history and director of the Drugs, Health, and Society program at the University at Buffalo, who has a story or a question or a comment. 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. You can call or you can text. There is kind of a tension here, isn't there, between the desire to not overprescribe so that you don't, whether it's, barbiturates or today's opioids or whatever happened in the Gilded Age more than 100 years ago, so that you don't overprescribe and get people addicted in those ways, but you also don't underprescribe. I mean, we once did a segment on the show a number of years ago about concerns that patients were allowed to remain in pain too much because doctors didn't want to prescribe potentially addictive painkillers.
Yeah, it's a really important point, and I'm glad you brought it up. We have a system, it's kind of like a two-stage engine, that cat and mouse game. And our system tends to overshoot the mark in both directions. So we overshoot the mark and oversell drugs. This is, the opioid crisis was caused not by paying patients getting too many opioids, but by communities being flooded by opioids. 3/4 of the people who developed an opioid addiction to pharmaceutical opioids had never been prescribed an opioid themselves. It was because it was that a community was flooded with pills. It was just so easy for anybody to get access to them. So you have that one problem of flooding communities with a dangerous drug with insufficient warnings about the potential dangers. And then the other problem, when that happens, our reaction afterwards is to slam down the walls really hard, just like what happened when I said authorities responded to this crisis of flooding by shutting off people who were long-term users of opioids. And that has had a devastating effect. And so we lurch from one extreme policy to the other, and we ignore the hard work of building a policy that delivers the drugs that people need. Everybody agrees these are incredibly important drugs. Fentanyl is an incredibly important drug in its proper place. And we really need to think pragmatically about how to deliver these drugs the way that we want them to be delivered, instead of either having them flooding communities because of the profit motive or being slammed shut in a kind of a ham-handed way because of the political value of declaring a war against drugs.
But in the contemporary era, enter fentanyl, and you write that it came to dominate the market because of its suitability for smuggling, not because consumers particularly wanted it. Explain.
Yeah, so when this generation of people who had become addicted first to pharmaceutical opioids, then they switched, and at first they were able to buy heroin, although it required some changes in the market. As far as we're able to tell from studies at the time, when fentanyl first appeared, they actually didn't like it. It had a slightly different subjective sensation that wasn't what they were familiar with and wanted. And it's a shorter acting drug. And so you needed to buy it and use it more often, which is really inconvenient. And of course, it's much more potent, so there's a greater degree of danger. So why did it appear if people didn't want it? And this is because prohibition markets, and I use that term instead of black markets because it makes it clear that because this kind of policy doesn't eliminate drugs, it's really just another set of incentives in a market. Prohibition markets incentivize products that are easier to smuggle. And fentanyl, about 100 times more powerful than other opioids that were available at the time, that meant you needed to move less of it to produce the same number of doses to sell. In other words, it's going to be more profitable per unit of weight. And it's also going to be easier to smuggle because it doesn't involve farmers and farms. The supply chain is much more streamlined. And because it's so small, you can evade detection. So in other words, in a white market, at least in theory, there are incentives to produce and sell in a way that takes into account consumer safety. That label, it says what it is, and it has to be accurate. The person selling it, their goal is the well-being of the person who's buying it. Of course, all in theory. But in a prohibition market, none of those things are there. There are no incentives for good manufacturing or safe, accurate labeling. It's just as illegal to sell high quality fentanyl that's mixed perfectly and is accurately labeled as it is to sell poor quality fentanyl that or even to be selling cocaine, claiming to be selling cocaine that is actually fentanyl, right? It's all illegal. So we give up on our ability to say to a producer, if you want to enter this market and make money selling to people, you have to meet these standards and you have to produce products that with consumer safety in mind. So in those prohibition markets, fentanyl is a great product, but for prohibition market consumers, it's been incredibly deadly.
As we continue with David Hertzberg, professor of history and director of the Drugs, Health, and Society program at the University of Buffalo, author of the New York Times essay called I Am a Drug Historian. Trump is wrong about fentanyl in almost every way. And we're going to go to some of your calls and texts now at 212-433, WNYC 433-9692. Professor, here's something from a text message. Says, I would honestly have no problem with the attacks on these boats if they did, in fact, remove fentanyl, legal or otherwise. That said, I think it is a ruse because his base likes fireworks. It appeals to the base. So talk about the effectiveness, or your premise is not effectiveness, of taking out these drug boats, even if they are carrying a lot of fentanyl.
Yeah, I mean, let's be clear. There's no evidence that I've seen that Venezuela supplies any fentanyl to the United States or is a significant source of any other drug. But let's just say that they did have fentanyl in them. Here's the problem. When you cut off a supply chain, right? So fentanyl is now coming into the United States. If you cut off the supply chain, you still have a bunch of people who are highly committed to buying fentanyl. Right? And those people are still going to be seeking out people selling them fentanyl. This will create a moment of market disruption where you have a mismatch between demand and supply. And that invites in new suppliers to meet that demand. And let's say nobody does it right away. They're afraid of being blown up. The prices for fentanyl will go up because there's high demand and low supply. Eventually, those prices will reach a height where someone is going to say, dang it, I'm going to give it a try. There's a lot of money to be made here. And we've seen this happen again and again over the last 150 years, that when you shut down one supply chain without doing anything about the demand, new supply chains come in. And because this is an illegal supply chain, right, this moment of disruption invites competition. And where there are no rules, hey, competition can get quite violent. This is just one important point, that the U.S. has suffered a lot of death and harm due to our misguided drug policies, but countries south of our border have suffered even worse because of the violence that gets associated with these moments of disruption. So really, you need to do something about both sides of this. It's clear that fentanyl is a bad product. The people selling fentanyl are just as responsible for that bad product as the opioid industry was for flooding communities with opioids. I have no desire to excuse them for selling this dangerous product, but we need to work on both sides of the equation. We need to find ways to insist that suppliers be responsible and protect the public health. And we also need to work with our domestic population and provide support that is needed for people with addiction to fentanyl, including access to safer opioids that can keep them from dying from this dangerous product.
Norm in Manhattan has a personal story, I think. Norm, you're on WNYC. Thank you so much for calling in.
You're welcome. Hi, Brian. Love your show. I think the professor is overlooking one drug that achieved mass popularity and was probably the most overprescribed drug during the 70s, and that was Quaaludes. And a number of manufacturers manufactured Quaaludes. Aurora manufactured Quaaludes. Smith, Klein and French had a variation of Quaaludes. Park Davis had a variation of Quaaludes until the FDA totally banned it and took it off the market, period, exclamation point. So you have not been able to buy Quaaludes here for quite a while. My own experience is it was the first drug that really got me in trouble. And when I could no longer get a script for Quaaludes, I switched to barbiturates, which were freely available. So we're talking about the old push-down pop-up effect. And that's what still goes on. That's what still drives the drug market today. And then barbiturates led me to placidals, which is still prescribed as a hypnotic, all fueled with alcohol. So I think you have to look at the overall effect. You can ban fentanyl, and I've had surgeries that use fentanyl, and I'm very grateful that fentanyl was used. But you can ban fentanyl, street use, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and before you could shake a stick, something else is going to pop up for sure. I know heroin has been substituted, and I'm very happy that I've been substance-free for a number of years. And I still follow the industry, and I still follow the comments and articles and programs like yours, Brian.
Norm, thank you so much for telling that story, which I think, Professor Hertzberg, completely exemplifies the arc of history that you've been describing in this segment and that you describe in your article, which is banning a particular drug doesn't solve the problem very often because then another drug pops up to replace it if the demand is still there. So in your experience, from your expertise as a drug and society expert and professor, what does reduce demand?
Well, it's the Quaalude example is really interesting and instructive on that front, because one thing I'm going to say is that it's not clear that demand can or even should be reduced. Using psychoactive substances is a pretty normal human behavior. The question is, under what circumstances does that normal human behavior become harmful? And that's what we need to try to prevent or to reduce. But in the case of Quaaludes are help demonstrate this, because Quaaludes is an example of, believe it or not, a success story, because we talk about this pop-up effect. You ban one drug and another shows up. The only reason that happens is because we let that happen, right? That in most markets, we're pretty good at capitalism. We tailor markets to provide the products that we want. With drugs, we don't do that, so that when we shut off OxyContin, then heroin pops up, and shut off heroin, then fentanyl pops up. This is something we can actually make deliberate choices about, and that's what happened with Quaalude. You have a whole class of drugs called sedatives that include barbiturates and benzodiazepines like Valium and Xanax and Klonopin, and they don't all present the same degree of risk and danger to users. And in the case of Quaalude, when they banned Quaalude, for number one, they did it slowly over time, and number two, they didn't ban all of the drugs of that class. So people who used Quaalude could shift to a different drug, which could be less dangerous. And the caller switched to barbiturates. A more common one was to switch to Valium, which of course Valium has its dangers, and this isn't a perfect outcome, but it's a better outcome, and that's sort of what we're looking at, because we can't reprogram humans to not want to use psychoactive substances. This seems to be part of who we are. What we can do is introduce frictions into the marketplace that make it harder to get more dangerous substances, and can encourage people to stick with the ones that we have a lot of experience with, we know how to use safely, and so on and so forth. So in that case, I think that we have a responsibility to not live in an imaginary world where it's possible to just get people to stop wanting to use drugs. I study this in American history. There hasn't been a time in American history where that was true. We started with the Gilded Age. We could go back to the American Revolution. Historians in my field call the period after the Revolution the Alcoholic Republic because of a huge boom in drinking. So, in other words, we need to change our target from drugs to drug harm.
One more call. Al in Summit. You're on WNYC. Hi, Al.
Hi. Yes, my name's Al Pock. I worked for a number of years in drug research, including, working at times with the DEA. And they've had a very standard way of interdicting boats coming in bringing drugs in terms of stopping them, boarding them, searching them, arresting the people, if they were smuggling drugs and capturing the drugs. And so it's been effective. And of course it could use more money to do this kind of interdiction against blowing up boats, whether you don't even know if they have drugs and you have no connection to what the supply line is. So it's completely counterproductive. And it is, as people say, a kind of extrajudicial killing of people, without any kind of adjudication or evidence. And so it must be more for show or for other reasons than real drug interdiction.
With your experience, Al, how would you respond to this argument that we may hear from the Trump people, which is that the old style of interdiction, arresting people after you board the boats if you really find drugs, obviously didn't solve the problem from the supply side because the fentanyl crisis has only gotten worse. And so if you blow up some boats, kill a few people, you're really going to dissuade people from taking that risk. What would you say to that?
Well, you can make that argument. It's the same argument as taking children away from their parents to scare people to come to the United States. There's a moral question involved. Number one, you could be killing innocent people. Number two, it seems that the drug interdiction, in terms of the international waters, was not funded that heavily. So that's another reason why, it didn't have the exact effect people want.
What would happen to the people who were arrested in those interdictions? Were they jailed in the United States? Were they deported back to their countries? Do you happen to know through your experience?
No, I'm not sure, but I'm sure there was a range of different, kinds of responses to them.
Al, thank you for your call. We really appreciate you sharing your experience in this area. So last question, Professor Hertzberg, why not an all of the above strategy if there are so many opioid deaths in this country and so much opioid addiction that causes other kinds of suffering, even for people who remain alive? Why not work on the demand side, the quality of life side, reducing even for people who use drugs, the possibility of overdoses, and at the same time work on trying to, through interdiction or whatever, reduce the supply?
That sounds great to me, actually. And the thing is, if we want to get practical about doing something about the supply side, that's exactly what we would need to do. We can't leave a huge vacuum of profit to be made by supplying people with, fentanyl's a terrible product. Our policy shifted suppliers to the point that they were supplying fentanyl instead of heroin. As weird as it may sound to say, it would be a supply side win if we shifted those markets back to heroin. It's a safer product.
Wow.
Right? And so this, to me, I think we do need to be really robust about dealing with supply. I just think the idea that we can eliminate the supply on its own isn't realistic, not going to be effective, and it's going to make things worse. We need to be hard-headed and practical about the supply and use the tools we've developed all through the rest of capitalism to get that supply to look the way that we want it to look instead of pretending we can make it disappear.
David Hertzberg, professor of history and director of the Drugs, Health, and Society program at the University at Buffalo. His New York Times piece is called "I Am a Drug Historian. Trump is Wrong About Fentanyl in Almost Every Way." Thank you for coming on with us.
Thank you for having me.
And there's a million things I haven't done, but just you wait. just you wait.
No, that's not the Brian Lehrer Show theme song. That, of course, is Alexander Hamilton from the hit Broadway musical Hamilton. This year marks the 10th anniversary of the premiere of Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical about the founding father. And since then, it has, of course, grown to be a worldwide cultural phenomenon. Frank DeLilla hosts On Stage on New York One and joins us now. He's out with a new special called Hamilton, 10 Years, A Legacy on New York One, where he revisits the origins of Lin-Manuel Miranda's groundbreaking musical, how it's transformed over the past decade, and how the musical is a uniquely New York story. Frank, thanks so much for coming on. Congratulations on this piece. Welcome to WNYC.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Such a fan. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. So you spoke with Lin-Manuel about the Hamilton origin story. How did he wind up writing this play?
Well, he was on vacation. He had just finished his hit musical In the Heights, to great acclaim, no less, and goes on vacation, picks up Ron Chernow's biography on Alexander Hamilton, and just goes through it and realizes that this is something. This sings. Alexander Hamilton's story sings. And originally, it was going to be a concept album. Lin was inspired by, he's told me this many times, inspired by the concept albums of Jesus Christ Superstar and Evita, the way Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice got together and, created the music for these, or created these concept albums. And then ultimately from there, they became shows. Huh. And I remember having being at dinner with Lin at his agent's house back in 2012. And he was like, yeah, no, we're doing a concept album called Hamilton Mixtape. That is what this is. This is not a production. And we'll see where it goes from there. And ultimately, as they say, the rest is history, because we know what happened from there.
And another inspiration, your piece tells us, Jonathan Larson, who wrote Rent. So let's take a listen to what he told you about that.
Sure.
He was always kind of on the soapbox of musical theater should be in conversation with the world. Why do we think musical theater has to sound like this when it has always sort of absorbed the influences of the outside world, the musical influences and otherwise, and been in conversation with the world? People used to go to the theater to hear their favorite songs. And with Rent, that was a big part of bringing that back, of having, it was the first truly contemporary musical I ever saw. And so every time I'm writing a score, I'm just trying to have that score be in conversation with what people listen to now and the music I love. Yeah. So for me, the success of this and everything I write is just, I'm just sort of carrying that banner that he really created.
So there's more of that arc through the music and other musicals that came before. Another breakthrough, even though Hamilton is a story about the founding fathers who were all white men, the musical features a diverse cast. Can you remind us what that meant at the time, or how Miranda decided to cast it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the show reflects what America looks like today. And, I've been covering this show even before it was a show, as I mentioned, when it was supposed to be this mixtape experience. I remember doing a story at Lincoln Center in 2012 and hearing some of the music for the very first time, and hearing the hip hop influences and watching how people responded to that. And I've interviewed countless kids who've said, this is history that speaks to me. And there's nothing traditional about Lin's Hamilton. And it got me thinking, because Lin is such a student of the musical theater art form. And when I think of Hamilton and its place in the musical theater canon, I can't not think of Oklahoma for how it changed the art form, how Hair helped redefine the sound of what a musical could sound like. And of course, Rent for its music and the way it spoke to the world. And Hamilton does all of that and more. It's very much a part of that family tree, if you will. And there's no denying that incredible hip hop and rap artists have been attracted to this piece. He even put out an album years after the original Broadway cast album came out with people like Ashanti and Busta Rhymes and people who were, who felt a connection to this music, and they were doing covers of the music that was presented in Hamilton. So Lynn is very much ahead of the game when it comes to the art form of the musical theater.
Although, even though the cast is diverse, which was a breakthrough progressive decision at the time, critics of the play say it didn't address how problematic the Founding Fathers were, especially those who were slaveholders. Others say it glorifies the Founding Fathers in a way that erases indigenous peoples. Did you deal with that at all with Lynn in your story?
No, I mean, we did not cover that element to the show in our special.
Do you think that persists to this day? I don't know if you've, done any reporting on that for New York One, but do you think that conversation persists?
You know what I think is amazing about Lynn's project and the global phenomenon of Hamilton is the way that it, brings people into the world of musical theater. And it brings, as someone who is a champion of the theater and that art form, and just seeing how people are being brought to the theater who may not have gone to the theater, who thought the theater didn't speak to them. And I think that is the beauty of what Lynn has done with Hamilton.
Hamilton, as you emphasize in your special, is a very New York story. You walk around Lower Manhattan and visit some of the sites with Broadway Up Close founder Tim Dolan. Maybe talk about one or two of those, maybe Fraunce's Tavern at Broad and Pearl Street or Bowling Green Fence.
Yeah, one of the oldest and most historic bars in the city, Hercules Mulligan and Alexander Hamilton, it's been said that they went there and, shared drinks there. And we see that moment in the show, early on in the show. You walk throughout Lower Manhattan and, Trinity Church, where many of the characters who are featured or the folks who are featured in the musical are buried. And, it's you can walk Alexander Hamilton's in his footsteps and even touch some things. There's a gate actually up by Wall Street, a fence of sorts where Alexander Hamilton and Hercules Mulligan touched. There was a statue of King George where there is now a fountain. And ultimately, George Washington ordered the Declaration of Independence to be read down there. They toppled over the statue of King George, and that gate was up at the time. So when we were down during the walking tour, it was really cool. I said, so Alexander Hamilton would have touched this gate? And Tim Dolan said, absolutely. It's the only place you can actually touch that he's touched in New York City.
One more Lin-Manuel Miranda clip. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic forced Broadway to go dark. Took about a year and a half for it to reopen. So here he is at the Hamilton reopening on September 14th, 2021.
I don't ever want to take live theater for granted ever again. Do you? It's so sacred. And this incredible company has been rehearsing. They've been rehearsing in their apartments. They've been rehearsing and keeping their bodies limber for a year and a half. And they had their first rehearsal for an audience on Sunday night, and they were missing something. They were missing the most important collaborator they have, and that's you.
And that courtesy of audio from Channel 7. So, Frank, it's been this long now since the reopening for you as the theater reporter for New York One. How's Broadway doing?
Broadway, the 2024-2025 season, from a financial perspective, did the most it's ever done, beating out the 2018-2019 season. They did well over $1.8 billion. Now, in terms of people in seats, we're still a tiny bit below. 2018-2019 is still the highest season when it comes to people in terms of attendance. But, people always say, how's Broadway doing? How's Broadway doing? And I say, my response is, when one show closes, there are 4 shows waiting in the wings to get into a Broadway space. So to me, that is a great sign. There are a lot of exciting things to see right now on Broadway. And, go to the theater.
Frank DeLilla is Spectrum News New York One's theater correspondent and host of On Stage. and he's got this special about Hamilton at 10. When can people see it?
They can see it online at ny1.com.
Thank you so much for sharing it with us, Frank. Great to have you on.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to Brian Lehrer Weekend. We're back on the radio Monday morning at 10 a.m. In the meantime, follow us on Blue Sky at The Brian Lehrer Show, where there's always a conversation 24/7.